Okay, let's have a little bit of a closer look at NIDA's distinction between formal and dynamic equivalence now. So this was the new scientific approach proposed by NIDA, and I've put a little photo of him up there just so you can visualise the man as well. So one was formal equivalence, which was basically similar to literal translation, focusing on the message of the text itself, also looking at form and content very closely, and making sure that the message in the receptor language or the target language matches as closely as possible the source text or the different elements of the source language. So it is quite similar to the approach taken in literal translation. And we would call this a source text oriented approach. So an approach in translation that orients itself very strongly around the source text. Now we need to note here that there aren't always formal equivalents between language pairs, and this is something we've already discussed earlier in the seminar. So the use of these formal or existing equivalents might actually result in a translation that doesn't quite work for the target audience. So we need to be aware of the fact that if we follow formal equivalents, we might run into problems if we don't actually have existing equivalents at hand to use in our translation. So often these source text oriented translations can result in slightly difficult text in the sense that they're not as fluent as they could be because they rely so heavily on these source text forms, which of course might be different in the target language. The other option that NIDA presented was dynamic equivalence. And this is certainly the more favoured approach. This adheres to the function of the target text. So the equivalence here is based on what NIDA calls the relationship between the receptor and the message being the same as that which existed between the original receptors and the message. So this is asking us to consider where the text is going. Who is this text for? Why is it being translated? And if we take the example of a political speech, of course a political speech in terms of its function is designed to move the listeners, to have some kind of impact on the listeners. So this is the aspect of equivalence which would be important to follow if we were to take a dynamic equivalence approach. So the message has to be tailored to the receptor's linguistic needs, cultural expectations, and also it aims at complete naturalness of expression. So this means that we might have to move away from the source text in order to do this, which is why it differs from formal equivalence in its approach. Another activity now, and again I'd like you to bring your notes to the workshop. Translate the following sentence using each of NIDA's approaches. So using formal equivalence and using dynamic equivalence. The sentence is, I looked outside and sighed, it was raining cats and dogs. So have a little think about it. Bring your various options that you come up with to the workshop and we will discuss your translations there. Okay, remember when you actually translate, you're not going to necessarily use only one approach. So you won't get a source text, and say, okay, I'm actually going to translate this entire text using formal equivalence. I'm getting you to do that as an exercise to illustrate a point. But usually when we translate, we use various different approaches. And you need to isolate as translators, or be able to isolate the instances in which a formal approach is required versus when a dynamic approach might be required. So I just wanted to mention that point. Talking about changes that occur when we translate, Catford refers to these as shifts. So these are any deviations, if you like, from the source text that might occur in the target text. He calls them formal departures from formal correspondence. So this might be things like word order changes, restructuring that has to occur because, of course, languages are different in the way that they might structure a text, or in the way in which the syntax is structured. It could also be on the level of things like politeness markers, etc. So, for example, in English, we don't have politeness markers for pronouns like you, which I know exist in various other languages. So these might be areas in which shifts occur. So these are simply a way of describing departures from the source text. So going back to dynamic equivalence, it's a way basically for the translator to translate in a way that will trigger the same effect or impact on the target culture audience as the original wording did on the source text audience. This might mean that things are changed in the text. So some of the things I've just talked about, like word order, structure, certain markers in the text might change. But as long as the changes in NIDA and Taber's words follow the rules of back transformation in the source language, of contextual consistency in transfer, and of transformation in the receptor language, the message is preserved and the translation is faithful. So this is saying that a translation isn't only faithful if it is source text oriented. So don't think for a second that equivalence is measured only along those lines. A translation can in fact be faithful and still change quite a lot in the process in order for this text to be faithful to the message or faithful to the communication context. So again, thinking of something like a speech, which is a very obvious and easy example to use in these contexts, but a translation of a speech to be read out particularly, that is faithful, would need to be faithful to all of those elements that make it a speech, those kind of operative elements that make us want to inspire the audience and to get the audience thinking along a certain path. So in those contexts, these are the kinds of things that a dynamic equivalent approach would deem as triggers of faithfulness. Pim came up with the example of like a bull in a china shop, and of course idioms are very, very good examples to use when we're talking about equivalence, because of course if we translate like a bull in a china shop using formal equivalence, we might actually slightly destroy the message and the way in which that message is supposed to be received by the target audience. Usually when we translate an idiom, we'll look for an idiom that expresses that same thing in the target culture, even if it means moving away from the words, for example, used in the source text. So NIDA favours dynamic equivalence as a more effective translation procedure because it's far more than what he calls mere communication, correct communication of information. So even though NIDA is quite linguistic in his approach and he's quite focused on words and kind of more micro aspects of the text, he's actually very much interested in this idea of transferring the message and its semantic quality and making sure that this message is clear in the target text. So his 4 basic requirements of translation actually are fairly good ones, I think. And ones that you should definitely keep in mind as being very helpful in your translation practice. Making sense, of course, is the first one. Conveying the spirit and manner of the original, and by this he doesn't necessarily mean the spirit in a philological sense. He more means honouring the way in which that text was originally put together. Particularly if we think of literary texts here, the spirit might refer to the way in which the author has written that text using particular authorial style, etc., that might be very intrinsic to the makeup of the text itself. Having an easy and natural form of expression, well, this speaks to the fact that a good translation is often cited as one that sounds like it was originally written in the target language. It doesn't sound like a translation. And you all would have been online and encountered websites. It's particularly prolific in web translation. We see translations all the time which they sound like translations. It's fairly obvious that they're translations because this easy form of expression and naturalness of expression has not been honoured. And in some cases also it's because they're written by non-native speakers, which is also an issue to consider there. Producing a similar response refers again to this idea of function. So the key role that NIDA really played in the development of translation studies was to introduce this idea of a receptor or a reader, so that the text is going somewhere. It's not just a translation that's sitting there, but it's a translation that has a function or it has a role to play in the target culture. The problem of non-equivalence, so this is describing the problem of when we can't find an actual equivalent in our target culture, is described in quite a lot of detail by Mona Baker in her 2011 revised edition of In Other Words. And Mona Baker is a theorist that is often aligned to equivalence. Choosing a suitable equivalence, of course, always depends on the context of the translation. Some might be linguistic, others cultural. And she importantly points out that we being people who teach translation, can't provide guidelines on dealing with the various types of non-equivalence that exist interlingually. So we can't say this is what you do when this occurs, because as translators you need to be able to decide yourselves on what to do. So there'll be never a right or wrong issued to you in translation. But we can discuss the various strategies of dealing with non-equivalence, which we will do in our workshop when we give you some of the workshop tasks. But there are bound to be words in your language pair that don't have equivalence, and you can probably already start to think about these. I'm thinking, my language pair is German and English, and I'm thinking of the word gemütlich in German, which has no word-for-word equivalence in English. So that means when we describe gemütlich, for example, that means we have to use more than one word to describe it. We often have to use various words to describe it. It basically means a cozy, warm, inviting atmosphere. But you can see that I need various words to describe that, what I can describe as one word in German. And I never quite get exactly to the point that I get to in German. So I never achieve complete equivalence, although, as Jacobson says, I can get there with synonyms. Okay, so strategies of dealing with non-equivalence can often mean that we can't necessarily arrive at a perfect solution, but we can certainly try to get there or get as close to equivalence as possible. So we'll be discussing these kinds of strategies more in your workshop. There have been lots of criticisms of equivalence theory, and they continue to this day. Equivalence is often dismissed as being only concerned with word level, and Lefebvre, who of course is one of the cultural turn theorists, is an obvious person to critique this aspect, that it only really deals with what's happening at word level in the text. True equivalence is impossible. Well, the equivalence theorists have also isolated that as being an aspect of this theory. Questioning whether Nidus theory really is scientific, and this is certainly an issue because, of course, we know that in translation, as I just said, there is no right or wrong. There can be various options available. If you give the same text to 10 translators, you'll come up with 10 different results, and all of those results might be perfectly viable. So in terms of scientific, of coming up with a correct answer or one answer for a problem, there is certainly a question mark over this theory. Overtly or overly theoretical, this comes from Gensler. A dynamic equivalence serves to convert the receptors to ideas of Protestant Christianity, and this of course stems from the fact that Nidus' work stems from his work as a Bible translator. And it emphasises the binaries in translation, which is problematic, that often translators think there is an either or. It's either dynamic equivalence or it's either formal equivalence. It's either foreignization or it's domestication. It can't be in between. And this is an issue in translation studies, that there is too much focus on these binaries.